What's good, YouTube? Welcome back. Today it is the LazyDaze Channel and we're back at it again with some more history reaction for you guys today. And for today we have some new content by TikHistory and we are doing the main reason why Germany lost World War II, oil. We are really looking forward to finding out what the reasons why in this episode. You guys have highly suggested this video, so we definitely hope you enjoy it. If you guys haven't already, please head over to TikHistory's channel. A link will be in the description box down below. If you guys are enjoying our reaction, like, comment, subscribe. But we're just going to jump straight into this one.
Let's do this.
If Hitler had not invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, he would likely have never got another chance. People keep saying that the Germans should have produced more panzers, they should have produced more planes, or produced more submarines. People can't understand why Hitler allows the British to withdraw from Dunkirk, or why his generals call him mad for ordering his men to stand fast and fight to the death when he has so little manpower, even though these are actually strategically sound decisions given the circumstances. Why did Germany have to invade the Soviet Union in 1941? Why was their army marching on foot instead of riding in trucks? Why are they reliant on horses? It's all related to the same question. Why did Germany and the Axis powers lose World War II? And it can all be summed up with just one word: oil. Let's find out why. Few people seem to realise just how severe the oil crisis was for the Axis in World War II. World War II has been described by one academic historian as the first war for oil. When you study World War II, you should have the oil crisis in the back of your mind, because that is how important it is. And we'll find out exactly why in this video. Oil is not the only factor, but oil is the most important one, and it's what dooms the Axis to defeat in World War II. That's not to say they didn't have a chance of victory, but oil is a massive problem for Germany, who's relying on Blitzkrieg or Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, to win its wars. It's also the reason that after the war, Britain is no longer a superpower, and the Soviet Union and the United States are. Although that's a topic for another day. Below you'll find a pinned comment with timestamps for parts of the video, so if you want to skip ahead you can do that, but I wouldn't recommend skipping ahead in this case because you'll miss the context. But you'll also find sources, the sources that I use, down there as well. Anyway, let's just start from the beginning. The 19th century was the age of coal. Britain was the leading coal producing country in the world, thanks to Welsh miners. It powered its ships with coal and thus dominated the waves. In fact, this was the reason that it had such a big merchant fleet. It was the only nation really able to power it thanks to coal. But in the early 1900s, it became obvious that oil was the emergent dominant energy source, since oil would power ships more effectively and would be able to power planes, cars, trucks, and eventually tanks, as well as industry as a whole. Coal could not power tanks, nor could it compete with oil. Therefore, on a strategic level, whoever controlled the oil controlled the world. And at this stage, the only real oil producer was the United States of America. Venezuela and the Soviet Union, plus a few other minor countries, are producing some oil, but the United States was producing nearly 70% of the world's crude oil at this stage.
Wow.
Britain,
70%.
Germany, France, Italy,
like
the old European powers do not produce oil. They became dependent on the USA and Venezuela, plus others, for oil, meaning that they now have to make sure they're on good terms with them in order to not pay over the top prices for oil, but also would have to secure access to them in the event of war. If they failed to do that, they would run out of oil very quickly. This is why the Weimar Republic sets about growing synthetic oil production, since Germany has little to no domestic oil production of its own. Synthetic oil production is essentially a process whereby coal is converted into oil. And that's how desperate they were for oil. They were willing to use coal, itself in great demand, and Germany was also short of that as well. The problem was that this was an expensive process, very expensive, but it was also a limited process. However, the cost was deemed to be essential on a strategic level in order for Germany to become economically independent from the oil powers. For Hitler, autarky, economic independence and self-sufficiency was the goal if Germany was to wage war, and oil was probably the biggest limiting factor that he faced. It took time to grow the domestic synthetic oil industry, and this was nowhere near prepared to meet the demands of Germany's oil consumption when Hitler's National Socialists took power in 1933. Germany was reliant on imports, and the oil producers during the 1930s were essentially the United States, Venezuela, and the Soviet Union, the nations that Hitler would wage war against or would not be able to trade with when war broke out. Even the Middle East, specifically Iran and Iraq, were not producing much oil at this stage, and what little they did produce could not be easily moved to Europe, as the British were finding out to their cost. This meant that both the British and the Germans were reliant on the USA and Venezuela for oil. In Europe, Romania is the largest exporter of crude oil, but even combined with German output, as well as the rest of the European output, like Hungary, this is simply not enough to meet European demand. In fact, Romanian oil production had sunk from 8.7 million tonnes in 1936 to 5.2 million tonnes in 1941, partly due to political reasons. So Romania isn't really a reliable source of oil, and in 1939 Germany still imported 60% of its petroleum requirements, and that's during peacetime. So what happens when the Germans go to war? The quick victories in 1939 and 1940 produce a massive energy crisis in Germany. When the French surrender, Britain decides to keep fighting. This means that imports from outside of Europe cease thanks to the British blockade. Germany's domestic oil production, synthetic or otherwise, now suddenly has to meet the demands of not only Germany itself, but all the countries it's just conquered. This was really bad news. Germany and a sphere of influence consumed 9,558,000 tonnes more oil than it produced. And this was in 1940. Britain, wooed to the last moment, had declared war on him, placing him in a position of strategic and economic dependence on the state whose annihilation was the central objective, the Soviet Union. Drastic measures were introduced in May of 1941 to curb oil consumption, and these were ordered by Hitler himself. These were so severe that in 1941, Economics Minister Walter Funk said that the economy was receiving less than 18% of its peacetime oil quantities. But it isn't enough, and even more cuts to the civilian economy followed. These cuts were so extensive that British Air Ministry observers secretly referred to them in early 1942 as the severest form of rationing. But it still isn't enough, and the German army is affected. In February of 1941, Goering is warned by General de Infantry Georg Thomas, head of the War Economy and Armaments Office, that fuel reserves would only last about 2 months during operational consumption, i.e. during an offensive. On the 8th of March 1941, Keitel was also warned by Georg Thomas that existing supplies of petroleum would run out in the middle of August or in the autumn. In March of 1941, General Erdhard Wagner, the Army Quartermaster General, gave an equally gloomy prognosis to Halder, informing him that once Germany lost its imports from the Soviet Union, existing stocks were only sufficient for 2 months of large-scale offensive consumption. Rommel has one eye on the petrol gauge at all times because the Italian fleet hasn't got enough oil to ship more oil across to him. In fact, the Italian fleet is sat in harbour throughout the war through lack of oil. In May
so even
1941,
the Italians can't do
Georg
anything
Thomas
to help.
again says Germany will run out of oil in late October 1941. In late May 1941, General Adolf von Schell, the man responsible for the motor vehicle industry, seriously suggested that in light of the chronic shortage of oil, it would be advisable to carry out a partial demotorization of the Wehrmacht. At this stage, the German army has 10 motorised and 20 panzer divisions at this stage, out of 151 divisions aimed at the Soviet Union. Yet here was the leading general of the motor industry seriously suggesting that they reduce this number even further. As a result of the fuel crisis, the Wehrmacht was forced to rely extensively on horse-drawn transport, which led to further problems. The tremendous difficulties in the pace of march between the motorised and other units raised the issue of when and how to close pockets. Horse-drawn columns were vulnerable to attacks that aggravated logistic problems, and the lack of fodder and replacement animals put a strain on civilian supplies. If they do nothing, the Germans and the Axis powers in Europe will lose their ability to strike. They either have to find peace with Britain or find oil elsewhere. There is an attempt to get more oil from Romania in the March of 1941 when Goering meets with Romanian dictator Antonescu in Vienna to discuss the raising of oil production in Romania. Goering also forms the Continental Oil AG in 1940 and 41, which was essentially a Central European fuel company that aims to get as much oil as possible. It secured the Romanian oil fields for Germany by buying out Belgian and French-owned oil companies in Romania, controlling 23% of the oil production in Romania by the spring of 1942. But Romanian oil could only really go so far, and peace with Britain now seemed remote. What option was left for Germany in late 1940 and 41? They could take the Middle East, but again, the oil industry there is in its infancy, and the British are not extracting much oil from it themselves. Plus, how would the Germans get that oil back to Germany to be refined? It's just not practical. So, unless he wants to watch his war machine and economy collapse, there's really only one viable option to Mr. Hitler at this stage. The occupied territories would drain Germany's meagre petroleum reserves within a year unless the Third Reich took immediate action to expand its supplies by invading the Soviet Union. On the 31st of July 1940, Hitler decides that the attack on the Soviet Union is going to happen. Some have said that Germany should have done one of several other options, like smashing the British in the Middle East or concentrating on the U-boat war. But it's clear, at least in Hitler's mind, that there's a time limit going on. At the Berghof on the 9th of January 1941, Hitler says that smashing the Soviet Union would represent a great relief to Germany and to Japan. After Russia's destruction, Germany would be unassailable. Russia's expanses contained immeasurable wealth. Germany must dominate them economically and politically, but not annex them. Thus, she would have all the potential for waging war, even against continents in the future. He needs Soviet oil, and his eyes are on the Caucasus. It is crucial to seize quickly and exploit the Caucasus oil fields, at least the areas around Mayakop and Grozny. In oil fields that have not yet been completely destroyed, it will take about a month to resume production and another month for its transport. We will have to seize those areas no later than the end of the operation's second month. If this proved unsuccessful, we must expect the most serious repercussions with unpredictable consequences for military operations after the 1st of September 1941 and for the survival of the economy. The 1st of September 1941. This is the date that Germany has to win by. If it doesn't win by early September, the Germans will suffer. Big time. Why does Hitler invade the Soviet Union when he does? Because June 1941 is the latest the Germans can actually invade. Why not earlier? Rainy season, Balkans, Russian winter in 1940-41. just to name a few issues. But there is an argument to say, well, he could have invaded a few weeks earlier, and that's fine. But the point is that the summer of 1941 is the last time Germany has the option to invade because of the oil crisis. Britain's decision to keep on fighting in 1940 forces this on Germany. The blockade prevents German imports of oil, starving the Axis of the means to fight. This is what triggers Germany to invade the Soviet Union and sets a time limit to that invasion. And either way, Germany invades the Soviet Union in 1941 with the goal of keeping this to a short war. It has to be short because they only have enough oil to fight it for a few months. The oil crisis dictates that Germany must win and take the Caucasus in 2 months, otherwise their army will be rendered ineffective. They must either knock out the Soviets completely, force their collapse or surrender, or crush the Red Army and then take the oil before the Soviets have time to recover. This is why going to Moscow in 1941 is wrong. This is why taking on Leningrad is kind of irrelevant. This is why Guderian is turned south to help Army Group South, which does in fact go into the Caucasus briefly in 1941 and is forced back. It's because Germany needs to get to the oil. The reason Barbarossa is designed to be a short, sharp campaign to wipe the Soviets out at the border and then ride off into victory is because of the oil shortage. It's not because of the limited manpower. It's not because they can't replace tanks. They actually can replace tank numbers, as shown in a previous video. The Germans have more tanks in 1942 than in 1941 and more tanks in 1943 than in 1942. The problem is that they can't run the tanks they already have beyond the autumn of 1941. Barbarossa is designed to crush the Red Army, then win. And there's no backup plan if this doesn't happen because it's do or die time. There's little to no mention about Soviet reserves because the Germans are hoping that they don't have any. If they do have reserves, they're not going to get the resources needed to fight them. It's interesting because according to Starhill, the first plans of Operation Barbarossa do not even factor in Soviet reserves at all. Paulus is the first to say, actually, the Soviets will probably have another 100 divisions behind the frontier troops. People say Paulus was a passive commander or bad commander, and I'll come back to that at a later date. But for Barbarossa, he was on the ball. Unfortunately, the Germans and for Paulus, it wasn't 100 reserve divisions, it was more like 300, although many were not anywhere near their full strength. But the Germans don't really have much choice. If they don't win in 2 months, their army won't be able to win because their main weapon, their panzers, won't have enough fuel to win. So it has to be a short, sharp campaign, and it has to be waged in 1941. Overy states that in 1941 Hitler made the mistake of invading the Soviet Union in the belief that the tactics of lightning war would bring about victory in 4 months. Why 4 months? They started on the 22nd of June, so July, August, September, October when they ran out of oil. It wasn't the invasion of the Soviet Union that was the problem, it was the fact that they hoped to win the war in just 4 months. If you read Guderian, you will know that Hitler's decision to turn south during Barbarossa cost the Germans the time needed to take Moscow. This was often seen as a mistake. No, it wasn't. If Germany succeeds in taking Moscow, that is obviously a grave disappointment for us, but it by no means disrupts our grand strategy. Germany would gain accommodation, but that alone will not win the war. The only thing that matters is oil. As we remember, Germany kept harping on about her own urgent oil problems in her economic bargaining with us from 1939 to 1941. So we have to do all we can, A, to make Germany increase her oil consumption, and B, to keep the German armies out of the Caucasus. That's a speech by Timoshenko in November of 1941. The Soviets will not surrender if Moscow falls, just like Russia did not surrender in 1812 against Napoleon. Hitler deemed Moscow to be, quote, not very important, and actually wanted to concentrate forces to the south. Halder did not want to do that, and subsequently the High Command did not do that, favouring the Moscow axis. Striking south makes more sense, and not just for the oil. Since the British blockade precluded the importation of additional foodstuffs from outside Europe, Germany faced the bitter prospect, as in 1917-18, of food shortages, hunger and political upheaval. Worryingly, Belgian miners had already gone on strike in the winter of 1940-41 to protest the meagre food supplies, while on the 1st of May 1941 German civilians had to face a drastic reduction in their own rations. Ukraine was a central target, as well as the Caucasus, which was also a fertile food production area. On the strategic level, most of the goals were in the south, the Ukraine and the Caucasus. It makes little sense then that Halder and his staff decide to concentrate in the north and centre. The German military leadership, in fact, displayed a woeful lack of understanding of economic factors by training and tradition focused almost exclusively on the operational tactical aspects of planning. The OKH designed a plan based on the lessons of the 1940 French campaign that emphasised a swift, decisive concentric thrust towards the enemy capital, unconcerned by the fact that the economically vital regions lay in the south. It's worth noting that after World War II, Halder is the advisor at the US Army Historical Division and is the central figure influencing the post-war German narrative of the war. He's the guy the other generals are going to, and he's the one who is coming up with the narrative that says Hitler was the cause of all of Germany's blames and mistakes during the war. Halder and his generals are not going to admit their own mistakes, and when you read the early World War II histories, the ones most people are familiar with, because that is the post-war narrative, they show that Moscow was the correct route and Halder was right and Hitler was wrong. Reluctantly, Hitler gave in to the urging of Brauchitsch, Halder and Bock and consented to the resumption of the drive on Moscow, but too late. This quote comes after a few pages of constantly going on about how Hitler made the wrong decision to turn south and how Halder was so right. This is why Guderian is saying how bad the decision to turn from Moscow and help the Army Group South was. Hitler said that the raw materials and agriculture of the Ukraine were vitally necessary for the future prosecution of the war. He spoke once again of the need of neutralizing the Crimea, that Soviet aircraft carrier, for attacking the Romanian oil fields. For the first time, I heard him use the phrase, "My generals know nothing about the economic aspects of war." Hitler's words all led up to this. He had given strict orders that the attack on Kiev was to be the immediate strategic objective, and all actions were to be carried out with that in mind. I here saw for the first time a spectacle with which was later to become very familiar. All those present nodded in agreement with every sentence that Hitler uttered, while I was left alone with my point of view. But Guderian is wrong, and is alone in his point of view because, as Hitler says, he doesn't understand the strategic and economic aspects of the war. And the best part is, Halder is actually awarded the Meritorious Civilian Service Award in 1961 for helping the US military in their historical research. So yeah, Halder and his cronies paint a completely biased picture of the war, blame Hitler for bad decisions even though they weren't, show themselves in as good a light as possible, even though they in fact made the bad decisions.
Are you alright?
And also, they get awarded for doing so. And apparently when you try and point this out to people, you get branded a revisionist. No, the German sources are biased, just like the Soviet sources, and they are twisting the facts to manipulate the way you perceive the war. And just to point out, there's no such thing as a revisionist historian. Historian, by definition, looks at the sources and questions them. If they don't do that, you're not a historian. Anyway, so Halder and the German general's narrative of the war is biased towards the Moscow axis and is painting Hitler as a madman. No, going towards Moscow is a terrible decision. So tight were fuel rations that in November 1941, Opel was forced to shut down production at its Brandenburg plant, Germany's largest truck factory, because it lacked the petrol necessary to check the fuel pumps and vehicles coming off the assembly line. A special allocation of 104 cubic meters of fuel had to be arranged by the Wehrmacht's economic office so as to ensure that there was no further interruptions. The German economy is on its last legs. The German Wehrmacht is critically short of fuel despite having absolute priority. It runs out of fuel in October and November 1941. The Germans, in fact, reach the Caucasus and take Rostov in 1941, but are thrown back during the Soviet winter counteroffensive. Interestingly, terrible German logistics actually plays into their favour, as Hayward points out, because the backlog of fuel trains ends up clearing in December, and fuel therefore does get to the front, which allows the German army to fight on through the winter months. But essentially, from this point on, the Germans are now not able to wage the war that they had before. They can no longer advance on a broad front like they did during 1941. They would only have enough fuel to supply one German army group. This is why Moscow isn't taken in 1942. Instead, Hitler sends his panzers south. This is his last chance to find oil. Kassel and Stalingrad is Hitler's absolute last chance of winning the war. He even says, "If I do not get the oil of Mayakop and Grozny, then I must end the war." And he was right. Fuel too was in such short supply that the Wehrmacht High Command in 1942 cut the fuel ration to the Alstheer considerably, a blow to its mobility accentuated by the serious loss of horses. The OKW warns in June of 1942 that the army will have no choice but to partially demotorise. Yes, demotorise. Those of you who say that the Germans didn't have enough tanks or trucks or equipment, you're half right. They actually did have enough tanks. Tank numbers were greater in 1942 than in 1941, and again in 1943 compared to 1942. The problem is that they don't have enough petrol to run the ones that they've got already. Tellingly, at a time when the Soviets were rapidly rebuilding and mechanising their forces, the Wehrmacht was in the process of re-equipping its reconnaissance units with bicycles. This demodernisation of the Alstheer did not bode well, given that the success of the campaign depending on seizing objectives more than 800 miles from the German start line, an operational and logistic challenge greater than that of the previous summer. A lot of people, including historians, say that the Germans were aiming for Baku. The Germans don't actually need to take Baku, they just need to take Mayakop and Grozny. And technically, they do get to them, but they only manage to extract 750 tons of crude oil from them per month before they're forced back. But this is Hitler's last chance. He's now at war with Britain and the Soviet Union, which is bad enough as it is, but he's also now at war with the United States, the leading oil power of the world. America's trucks, tanks, planes, trains, they sent a lot of trains to the Soviet Union, which may have been more important than the trucks they sent, and vast quantities of other equipment, well, they're on their way. And unlike the Germans, the Allies have the fuel to run them. It's just a matter of time. Hitler knows this, and knows his only chance to fight against the material superiority that's heading his way is to capture the oil in the Caucasus. If he gets the oil, his economy will be saved, and he would have the resources of continental Europe at his disposal. He would have the fuel to motorise and mechanise his army, and the panzers would have the fuel they need to actually fight. The Blitzkrieg would be back on, but he only has a narrow window of opportunity to take the oil. This is why it was vitally important that the Caucasus be taken in 1942, and why the Stalingrad campaign is important too. There's two aspects to this plan of Hitler's as well. The first is to get the oil at Mayakop and Grozny. The second is to cut the Soviets off from Baku. Now he can't get to Baku, but what he can do is block the Volga. Perhaps they shouldn't have gone into the city of Stalingrad, but sat south of it on the Volga and just prevented the oil tankers from heading north. And, well, we'll leave the tactical decisions behind this debate for another day. But if the Germans cut the Volga, the Soviet Union would be crippled. The loss of the Caucasus would deprive the Soviet Union of half of its oil reserves and 80 to 90% of its crude oil production, refinery output and pipeline capacity. Meanwhile, severing the transit lines along the Volga would eliminate the most effective means of moving oil to central Russia from either the Caucasus, covering a distance of 1,200 kilometers on average to reach its domestic consumers, or the Volga Urals, the second Baku. Without oil and without food, and by the way, the Soviets were getting hungry already thanks to the loss of the Ukraine, the Soviet war effort would be in a dire situation. This would have given Hitler the oil he needed to keep fighting and deprived the Soviets of the oil and food they needed to fight effectively. Germany would have been placed in the best position, the best chance of winning, if they'd taken the Caucasus and cut the Volga. This was Hitler's last real gamble. This is why the Stalingrad campaign is a turning point. It may not be the big turning point of the war. Arguably, that may have already happened, and we'll ask that question, what was the big turning point of the war, in another video. But if Hitler had won this fight in 1942, it's likely that the Soviets would have collapsed in 1943, 1944. German economic assessments of the Soviet Union's precarious economic situation in early 1942 also had some merit. The Soviet economy was in fact on the verge of collapse due to the loss of numerous economic and raw materials assets during Operation Barbarossa. Moreover, the Soviet Union was already dependent by 1942 on Lend-Lease assistance, especially food and specialty petroleum products such as high-octane gasoline. Consequently, there is every reason to think that the loss of the Caucasus would have rendered the Red Army combat ineffective within a year. Cutting the oil route north would mean that the Red Army would barely have enough reserves of oil to wage war in 1943, and probably would have paralysed what remained of Soviet agriculture production. And Stalin knows this as well. He tells Deputy Oil Commissar Nikolai Beerpikov that if he doesn't destroy the oil fields before the Germans capture them, he would be shot. The Soviets therefore ensured that the oil fields are destroyed, so thoroughly in fact that even the Germans were impressed by the effort they went to do it. The issue with the 1942 campaign was that, well, it's off distance. The Germans simply don't have enough men and equipment to do the task. I'll be covering this in great detail in my upcoming Stalingrad documentary, but effectively the Germans and Axis allied forces are not capable of what was needed, and they are defeated. When you read the accounts of German panzer formations advancing in this campaign, you hear how they keep running out of fuel. This means their attack on Stalingrad, for example, is often a stop-start affair, as they're waiting for more fuel to catch up to them. Yes, logistics does play its part, but actually a lot of it is simply the fact that the Germans have run out of fuel. Germany carried on the war until 1945, and its economy didn't collapse because of a lack of oil resulting from not capturing the Caucasus. This is true, but that doesn't mean they weren't chronically short of oil. Synthetic fuel allowed Germany to wage war, but not to win it. Right. Germany's economically illiterate generals scoffed at economic advisors who urged the conquest of the Caucasus by pointing out that Germany managed to carry on the war until 1945 without ever securing the Caucasus oil. But at no point after the failures of 1941-42 did Germany ever possess the opportunity to end the war on favourable terms. Rather, Axis Europe had to spend the rest of the conflict labouring under constant shortage of energy, which constrained economic productivity and reduced military effectiveness. Hayward also points out that the German economy didn't collapse, and that even some of the economic reports about the lack of oil were a little bit exaggerated. However, there are reasons the Germans continue to fight. Italy defected to the Allies, so the Germans captured Italian oil reserves. They also ramped up synthetic oil production, which helped massively, although was never going to be enough. They're also fighting a mostly defensive war at this point, so fuel isn't getting used as much. There's also a reduction in the number of fighting vehicles. Some Luftwaffe training regimes were closed because of a lack of fuel, and the Luftwaffe as a whole was suffering from a chronic lack of fuel. During the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans were relying on capturing Allied fuel stocks, and Piper even drove half-tracks through minefields to clear them because, well, they'd run out of fuel. The weapons of war are useless when you don't have the fuel to run them, which is why it was a sound strategy to drive half-tracks over mines. And there's other examples, but essentially the economy didn't collapse until the US Air Force hammered the synthetic oil plants in late 1944 and 1945. And this whole oil crisis explains some of the other aspects of the war, including Hitler's stand-fast orders. People don't seem to understand Hitler's stand-fast orders. His generals were the most vocal on this subject, even going so far as to call him mad. That argument is convincing from a tactical point of view, but not from a strategic point of view. Hitler says he either takes Mayerkop and Grozny, or must end the war. And so he takes them, and then holds on to them for dear life, hoping to simultaneously extract oil and starve the Soviets of oil. Where does he starve them of oil? The Volga at Stalingrad. Now, it can be argued that Stalingrad wasn't necessary for this. They could have gone south of the city and blocked the Volga there, and I agree. However, once committed at Stalingrad, Hitler's reasoning for standing fast on the Volga is kind of understandable. Not just from a tactical point of view, but from a strategic point of view. He's trying to block the oil shipments up the Volga, and not withdrawing from the Caucasus makes sense because he's trying to extract the oil. There's also the promise from Manstein, who says he'll link up with the Sixth Army, and then there's also Jesenek's indication that the Luftwaffe could supply the Sixth Army by air. Anyway, it turns out to be a complete disaster, as we know. After this, though, why stand fast? Well, let's not forget who Hitler was. He had fought in the First World War, and so he does not want to repeat the stab in the back surrender that caused the Germans to lose World War I. After World War I, the German opinion was that the German army had not been defeated in the field, and had in fact been stabbed in the back by the government. Hitler, having lived through that war, and having shared this opinion most vocally, is not willing to surrender in this second war for this reason. And in 1943 and 1944, the Germans are still fighting deep in Soviet territory. They are weak, but far from defeated. But now they have this critical oil crisis that prevents the movement of their motorized units. The German generals are suggesting that they should just move back in order to consolidate and then buy time for another counterattack. They're saying that they want to fight a maneuver war, and that's perfectly understandable. However, they are thinking from a tactical and operational point of view, not a strategic point of view. Their fuel supplies are inadequate. They can't fight the maneuver war that they want to. When you look at what Hitler's saying, I shouldn't have listened to my generals, he's right. They wanted to go to Moscow, they wanted Leningrad, they wanted to retreat. They were wrong. Generals like Manstein are relieved of command and replaced by generals who will stand and fight. About his dismissal, Manstein says that Hitler still had faith in him, but at the moment, however, there was no further scope for me in the East. The task now pending, he considered Model, who had stopped a difficult retreat in Northern Army Group, to be especially suitable. He goes on to say about the Army Group command he was handing over to Model. Its only remaining commitment was to assist the fighting troops and give them moral support. That Model would certainly be able to do. The Führer empathically agreed that Model was a particularly suitable choice in this respect, as he would dash around the divisions and get the very most out of the troops. Manstein was the old maneuver warfare general, whereas Model was the type of defensive general who would stand and fight to the last. This is why Model was known as the Führer's fireman, because he was constantly putting out fires throughout the Eastern Front. The point being that there was no fuel left to wage the maneuver war that Manstein was good at, and that the war had moved to an attritional defensive battle stage. Hitler recognised that, and he also couldn't surrender, as stated. So, really, what choice does he have other than to stand and fight? He's playing for time, because that's all he's got left, and he's hoping for miracles. That's not the thoughts of a madman. This is his only option. If he surrenders, he's dead. So he has to keep fighting. Given the situation strategically, this is his only option, and he's not mad for taking it. He's desperate and he's clutching at straws, but he's not mad. The oil crisis dictates that this has to happen. I also think it's interesting that up until late 1942, Hitler is mostly willing to listen to his generals and mostly willing to allow them to do what they think's best. Stalin is the opposite of this, and yet during the Battle of Stalingrad, Stalin and Hitler seem to swap personalities. Hitler becomes less willing to listen to his generals and less willing to allow them the freedom of action they want. Stalin does start listening to his generals and does start allowing them to make their own decisions. It's as though both dictators realised at the same time that the tide had changed, that Hitler had lost the war and Stalin had won it. And it isn't just because of the fall of the Ukraine and the food or the coal or the other aspects. And it's not because the Wehrmacht was defeated. It was because Hitler had not taken the oil and not won the oil rush. And he had spent his last energies trying to get there. Once this is realised, both seem to swap roles. And that to me is very interesting. There's obviously a lot of factors going on here, but that change of personality indicates that the tide of war had changed. Now, of course, Hitler had been stubborn before this, and sometimes his decisions don't seem to make much sense on the surface, such as Dunkirk. Why allow the British to withdraw from Dunkirk? Now, I'm going to hold my hand up in here and just say that I'm only suggesting that this is a factor. And I'm not saying this is the absolute 100% the only reason for this. I'm only suggesting that this should be factored in to the debate about Dunkirk. Okay, I'm going to suggest that some of the historians who say that Hitler did it for political reasons because he is trying to appease Britain may have been right. Why would he try and appease Britain? Britain, by fighting on, is no real threat to Germany, at least not by itself. Its army is small, they're struggling in North Africa against the Italians and then later Rommel and his 3 divisions, and its air force is good but not able to seriously hurt Germany at this time. But what the British have is the Royal Navy, and Hitler knows what they'll do with it. Blockade. Just like they do in the First World War, Germany is blockaded. Shipments of oil from the United States and Venezuela cease, and this is the ticking time bomb for Germany. This limits Germany's potential to win the war, resulting in the invasion of the Soviet Union. But if Hitler can appease the British or persuade them to come to peace, it would allow shipments of oil to keep coming into Germany and maybe buy him time to turn his army into a fully motorised and mechanised force. In this context, Dunkirk makes sense. Let's allow the British to withdraw, showing Britain that, hey, we don't want to fight you, let's go for peace, eh? This is Hitler trying to win the British over. But, of course, Churchill has none of it. Okay, fine, so let's threaten to invade and then put political and economic pressure on Westminster to peace out by bombing them and then sink their ships. Hitler doesn't need a victory, he just needs peace. Goebbels says he doesn't want at all to annihilate England nor destroy its empire, but we must have calm. Kershaw says while he was at the Berghof, Hitler had talks with his military leaders about a possible invasion of Britain should his peace offer be rejected. At these discussions, an invasion was still seen as a last choice rather than a first option. As Richard Overy states, he was forced to attack the Soviet Union because Britain's stupid chiefs refused to make a sensible peace. Perhaps, he reflected, he should have struck south, seized Gibraltar, and swept into the Near East to smash British resistance. Dunkirk, in this context, makes sense. Allow the British army to withdraw. It's not really a threat anyway, and we don't really want to invade England. And then try and get the British to accept peace. Perhaps this is why Hitler stopped the panzers. If the British can be persuaded to come to terms on the peace table, the blockade will be lifted and Germany will have access to more oil. Maybe this was for economic reasons. In his biography of Hitler, Kershaw suggests that this wasn't the case and that Dunkirk was in fact a purely military decision. In Schirer's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, he has a debate about it, citing our beloved Halder over and over again, and seems puzzled when some generals suggest that Hitler was happy to let the British Empire live on. Halder, of course, says Hitler was at fault, and that it was his military decision, although admits that there are second political decisions and reasons as well. Halder blames Goering and sides with Rundstedt, who says he wasn't the one who sided with Hitler, even though he did, and there's other generals as well that seem to be on Hitler's side in one account and then not in another, and it's a whole,
every single one of them.
The debate goes on, it's a massive mess. And really, it does deserve a video on its own, but I'm going to suggest that Hitler had the oil situation in the back of his mind as well. And in that context, it adds weight to the idea that Hitler was trying to appease the British. In that sense, he does not need victory, he just needs peace. Again, I'm just suggesting that this was a factor, not necessarily the only factor. Right or wrong though, I would love to hear your thoughts on this point, so let me know. 90% of the world oil supplies were controlled by the Allies. So deficient were the Axis powers of oil, they were willing to wage war to obtain it. This was the Axis Achilles heel. The British decision to keep fighting in 1940 results in a blockade of Europe that prevents oil from getting to Germany. Hitler is therefore forced to fight a war with the Soviet Union, which doesn't collapse in 1941 as expected, but keeps fighting. This forces Hitler to gamble in striking towards the Caucasus in 1942 in one last attempt to get to the oil that he needs to wage the war, and is prevented from doing so by what happens at Stalingrad. After this point, Hitler's only real choice is to fight, and buy him as much time as possible, leading to an increasing use of stand-fast orders. Ultimately, Germany didn't need more panzers or trucks or submarines or planes because it couldn't run the ones it had. Oil is probably not the only factor, but it is a big one. When you think of World War II, you should think of oil. It explains the war, it explains why one side won and one side lost, it explains the post-war world, why Britain is no longer a superpower, but the Soviets and the USA are, and it explains many of the decisions made at the time and even since. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know below. And if this makes sense to you, share this video. Tell people, hey, this is why Germany lost the war. Thank you to my patrons for making this video possible. Your support allowed the purchase of books.
I really enjoyed that episode. What about you, Jack?
Yeah, man, that was very interesting.
A lot of information, but I really do agree with a lot of the points he has said.
Yeah.
It definitely opens up your mind and thinking about it.
Yeah.
If you haven't already, please head over to his page. A link will be in the description box down below. If you enjoyed our content, like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and we will catch you in the next video.
See you in a bit.